The night was cold, the kind that seeps through your skin and settles into your bones. The wind howled through the alleyways, and the rain pounded the asphalt as if trying to wash away every trace of what had happened. In the sprawling mansion on the city's outskirts, where laughter and the clinking of glasses once echoed, a deathly silence now reigned. Only one sound pierced it, the creak of the front door swinging open, a groan so raw it seemed the house itself was in agony. Alexei stood in the foyer, his fingers gripping a glass of whiskey so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The chandelier's light reflected in his eyes, cold, steely, but shadowed by something else. Fear? Guilt? He couldn't tell. Before him, at the threshold, stood her. Elena. 6 years had passed since that night when he'd thrown her out onto the street like a dog that had chewed through its leash. 6 years, and now she was back. Her clothes were soaked from the rain, dark hair plastered to her face, but there wasn't a hint of weakness in her stance. Beside her stood 2 children, a boy and a girl, about 5 years old, with gray eyes so familiar that Alexei's breath caught in his throat. Twins, her children, and perhaps his. You? Alexei's voice trembled, though he tried to sound commanding. What do you want here? Elena lifted her gaze. Her eyes, once soft and warm, now blazed with an icy fire. I didn't come for you, she said quietly, but each word landed like a stone. The air between them thickened, heavy with unspoken history. Alexei's mind raced, clawing at memories he'd buried deep. Nights of rage, accusations, and that final shattering moment when he'd pointed to the door and roared, "Get out!" He'd built an empire since then, a fortress of wealth and power, convincing himself he'd erased her from his life. Yet here she was, a ghost from the past, standing in his doorway with 2 children who bore his features like a mirror he couldn't escape. Who are they? He demanded, nodding toward the twins. His voice cracked, betraying the panic rising in his chest. Elena didn't answer immediately. She stepped forward, her wet shoes leaving faint prints on the marble floor, and the children followed, clinging to her hands. The boy stared at Alexei with quiet curiosity, while the girl's gaze was sharper, almost accusing. They're mine, Elena said at last, her tone cutting through the silence. And they're the reason I survived. Survived. The word hung in the air, a blade poised to strike. Alexei's grip on the glass tightened further, and for a moment, he thought it might shatter. He wanted to demand answers, where she'd been, how she'd dared to return, what secret she carried that made her voice tremble with such controlled fury. But before he could speak, she tilted her head slightly, a faint, bitter smile curling her lips. You'll want to hear this, Alexei, she said, because it's going to destroy everything you've built. 6 years ago. The boardroom was a battlefield, all polished mahogany and gleaming glass, but the tension was thicker than the cigar smoke curling toward the ceiling. Alexei sat at the head of the table, his suit impeccable, his smile sharp as a knife. At 32, he was the youngest CEO in the company's history, a self-made titan who'd clawed his way up from nothing. The deal they were closing that day, a hostile takeover of a rival tech firm, would cement his legacy. Elena sat to his right, her presence quieter but no less commanding. She wasn't just his wife, she was his partner, the one who'd stood by him through sleepless nights and ruthless gambles. Her mind was as sharp as his, her instincts uncanny. It was her idea to exploit the rival firm's financial weaknesses, her research that had uncovered the cracks in their armor. Gentlemen, Alexei said, leaning back in his chair. This is the future. Sign the papers, and we all walk away richer. The room erupted in applause, but Elena's smile didn't reach her eyes. She'd been distant for weeks, her warmth replaced by something he couldn't name. He'd dismissed it. Stress, he told himself, or maybe the strain of their crumbling marriage. They'd fought more lately, over money, over his late nights, over the empire that consumed them both. That night, after the champagne had been poured and the last guest had left, she confronted him in their penthouse. The city skyline glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, a kingdom they'd built together. "You've changed, Alexei," she said, her voice low but steady. "This isn't what we dreamed of." He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "What we dreamed of. This is power, Elena. This is everything." She shook her head, stepping closer. "I found the accounts, the offshore ones. You've been siphoning money, millions, behind my back." The accusation hit him like a punch. He'd been careful, meticulous, but she'd always been smarter than he gave her credit for. Rage flared in his chest. How dare she question him after all he'd done? "You don't get to judge me," he snarled, slamming his glass onto the table. "You think you're so pure? Get out. If you can't handle this, you don't belong here." Her eyes widened, then hardened. She didn't beg or cry. She turned, grabbed her coat, and walked out into the storm. He didn't stop her. He told himself she'd come crawling back. She didn't. Alexei stared at the twins, his mind reeling. The empire he'd built after that night, the deals, the wealth, the reputation, felt like a house of cards teetering on the edge. Elena's words echoed in his skull. "It's going to destroy everything you've built." "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Elena stepped closer, her gaze unyielding. "You threw me out, Alexei. You thought I'd break, but I didn't. And now I've come back with something you can never outrun." The boy tugged at her hand, whispering something Alexei couldn't hear. The girl kept staring, her eyes boring into him like she knew every sin he'd ever committed. "Tell me," he said, almost pleading now. "What's the secret?" Elena's smile widened, cold and triumphant. "You'll find out soon enough. But first, let me tell you what happened after you left me in the rain." The room seemed to shrink around him, the walls closing in as her words promised a reckoning he wasn't ready to face. The silence in the foyer stretched taut, a wire ready to snap. Alexei's whiskey glass trembled in his hand, the amber liquid sloshing against the sides as Elena's words hung in the air like a guillotine blade. The twins stood motionless beside her, their small figures casting long shadows across the marble floor. The girl's accusing stare hadn't wavered, and the boy's quiet curiosity had morphed into something heavier, something Alexei couldn't name but felt deep in his gut. "After I left," he echoed, his voice a rough whisper. "You disappeared, Elena. No calls, no letters, nothing. I thought you were gone for good." "Gone?" Her laugh was sharp, a shard of glass cutting through the tension. "You didn't leave me the luxury of disappearing, Alexei. You left me with nothing. No money, no home, no name, just the clothes on my back and the rain." She took another step forward, the wet hem of her coat dripping onto the floor. The sound was faint but relentless, a metronome ticking down to his unraveling. "I walked for hours that night," she said, her voice softening but laced with steel. "The storm didn't let up. Neither did I. You thought I'd crawl back, didn't you? Beg for your forgiveness." Alexei's jaw tightened. He wanted to deny it, to say he'd never expected her to return, but the truth gnawed at him. He'd spent weeks after that night waiting, half expecting her to show up at the penthouse, broken and contrite. When she didn't, he'd buried the guilt under layers of ambition, telling himself she'd been weak, that she couldn't handle the life he'd built. "I survived," Elena continued, her eyes locking onto his. "Not because of you, but despite you. And these two." She gestured to the twins, her voice softening for a moment. "They're the proof." The girl stepped forward then, her small chin tilting upward. "Are you the man who hurt Mama?" she asked, her voice clear and piercing. Alexei flinched, the question hitting him like a slap. He opened his mouth to answer, but no words came. The boy tugged at Elena's hand again, his wide eyes darting between them, as if sensing the storm brewing. "Not now, Mila," Elena murmured to the girl, resting a hand on her shoulder. "He'll understand soon enough." Mila. The name struck a chord, a faint memory of a conversation years ago, Elena mentioning it as a name she loved. Alexei's head spun. Were they his? The timing fit, the eyes matched, but the thought was too enormous, too terrifying to grasp fully. "Tell me," he said again, desperation creeping into his tone. What happened after you left? What's this secret you're dangling over me? Elena's lips curved into that same bitter smile. Patience, Alexei. You always wanted everything now. Money, power, control. But this you'll have to wait for. Let's start with where I went that night. 6 years ago, the night of the storm. The rain was a curtain, blinding and merciless, as Elena stumbled through the streets. Her coat was soaked through, her heels useless against the slick pavement. She'd left the penthouse with nothing. No wallet, no phone, just the searing echo of Alexei's words. Get out. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't stop. The city she'd once ruled alongside him now felt alien, its towering buildings looming like judges passing sentence. Her mind churned with betrayal. Those offshore accounts she'd uncovered, millions funneled away from their company, their life, their future. She'd confronted him out of love, hoping he'd explain, hoping it was a mistake. Instead, he'd cast her out. Her legs gave out near a rundown diner on the edge of town, its neon sign flickering in the downpour. She collapsed onto a bench outside, shivering, her breath fogging in the cold. That's when the door creaked open, and a figure stepped out. A woman, older, with graying hair and a worn apron tied around her waist. You'll catch your death out here, the woman said, her voice gruff but kind. Come inside. Elena hesitated, pride warring with exhaustion, but the warmth spilling from the diner won. She followed the woman, whose name she'd learned was Vera, into the dimly lit space. The smell of coffee and grease enveloped her, a stark contrast to the sterile luxury of her old life. What's your story? Vera asked, sliding a mug of black coffee across the counter. Elena stared into the steaming liquid, her reflection distorted and unrecognizable. I don't have one anymore, she muttered. Vera snorted. Everyone's got a story. Yours just hit a rough chapter. Stay here tonight. I've got a cot in the back. Tomorrow, you figure out what's next. That night, curled up on a lumpy mattress in a storage room, Elena felt the first stirrings of something new. Not hope, not yet, but defiance. She wouldn't let Alexei win. She'd rebuild, somehow. What she didn't know then, as sleep finally claimed her, was that she was already carrying the twins. 2 lives that would become her anchor and her weapon. Alexei's glass slipped from his hand, shattering against the marble floor. The sound jolted him, but he barely registered the mess. Elena's story, so simple, so raw, cut deeper than any accusation. A diner, a stranger's kindness. She'd survived without him, while he'd spent those years climbing higher, convinced he'd left her in the dust. You think this changes anything? He said, forcing his voice to steady. You walked away. I moved on. Moved on? Elena's eyes narrowed. You built your empire on lies, Alexei. On my work, my ideas. And when I found out about the money, you threw me away like trash. But I didn't just survive. I learned things. Things about you. About the company. His stomach dropped. What things? She didn't answer directly. Instead, she knelt beside the twins, brushing a strand of wet hair from Mila's face. They're tired, she said, almost to herself. It's been a long day. Don't play games with me, Alexei snapped, stepping forward. You come into my house, threaten me with some vague secret, and now you're stalling. Tell me what you know. Elena rose slowly, her gaze locking onto his with an intensity that made his blood run cold. Oh, I will. But first, you should know what it cost me to get here, what I lost, and what I gained. Because the next part, that's where it gets interesting. She turned to the twins, guiding them toward a nearby sofa. Mila shot Alexei one last glare before sitting, while the boy, whose name he still didn't know, curled up beside her, clutching a small, worn toy car. Elena straightened, facing him again. 6 years ago, I hit rock bottom. But 5 years ago? That's when I found the first crack in your perfect little world. Alexei's heart pounded. He wanted to demand more, to shake the answers out of her. But something in her tone, calm, deliberate, deadly, told him he wasn't ready for what came next. The shattered whiskey glass lay in pieces at Alexei's feet, a jagged reflection of the chaos brewing inside him. The twins sat on the sofa now, their small forms dwarfed by the plush cushions, but their presence filled the room like a storm cloud. Mila's piercing stare hadn't softened, and the boy, still nameless to Alexei, rolled his toy car back and forth across his knee, the faint hum of its wheels a quiet counterpoint to the tension. Elena stood between them and Alexei, her silhouette framed by the dim glow of the chandelier. Her words from moments ago echoed in his skull. "That's when I found the first crack in your perfect little world. 5 years ago." What had she uncovered? His mind raced through the possibilities. Business deals, secrets he'd buried, enemies he'd made. He'd built an empire, yes, but empires always had shadows. "Stop with the riddles," he said, his voice low and tight. "You've got my attention. Now tell me what you mean." Elena tilted her head, studying him as if he were a puzzle she'd already solved. "You're scared, aren't you? Not of me, not yet, but of what I might know." "Good. You should be." She stepped closer, her wet coat brushing against the edge of the sofa, leaving a faint trail of dampness. The twins watched her, their trust in her absolute, and for a fleeting moment, Alexei envied that bond. He'd never known loyalty like that. Not from her, not from anyone. "5 years ago," she began, her voice steady but laced with something dark. "I wasn't the broken woman you left in the rain. I'd started over. It wasn't easy, but I had them." She nodded toward the twins. "And I had a reason to keep going. I wasn't looking for you, Alexei. I didn't want revenge. Not then. But fate has a way of digging up the past." He crossed his arms, trying to mask the unease coiling in his chest. "What past? You're talking in circles." Elena's eyes flashed. "Your past. The one you rewrote after you threw me out. The one where you took everything we built together and claimed it as yours. 5 years ago." The apartment was small, a cramped 2-room flat above a laundromat in a forgotten corner of the city. The hum of washing machines drifted through the thin walls, a constant reminder of how far Elena had fallen. She sat at a rickety table, a flickering lamp casting shadows across her face as she stared at the ultrasound photo in her hands. Twins. 2 tiny heartbeats growing inside her despite the wreckage of her life. She'd been 3 months pregnant when Alexei cast her out, though she hadn't known it then. The realization came weeks later when nausea and exhaustion forced her to a free clinic. The news had been a lifeline. She wasn't alone anymore. Vera, the diner owner who'd taken her in that first night, had become her rock, offering her a job and a place to crash until she could stand on her own. Now, a year after that stormy night, Elena was scraping by. She waitressed at the diner, her hands rough from scrubbing dishes, her pride battered but intact. The twins, Mila and Maxim, were her world, their cries and laughter filling the void Alexei had left. She didn't think about him much, not anymore. He was a ghost, a memory she'd locked away. Until that day. It started with a newspaper, left on a diner table by a customer. Elena was clearing plates when the headline caught her eye. "Tech Titan, Alexei Volkov expands empire with 500 Malrush acquisition." Her heart stuttered. She snatched the paper, her fingers trembling as she read. The article praised his brilliance, his ruthless ambition, his rise from nothing to everything. No mention of her. No trace of the nights they'd spent plotting together, the ideas she'd fed him, the sacrifices she'd made. She sank into a booth, the paper crumpling in her hands. Rage simmered, but beneath it was something colder, curiosity. How had he done it? How had he erased her so completely? She'd seen the offshore accounts before he threw her out, but she'd never had proof, never had time to dig deeper. Now, with his name splashed across the page, she wondered, what else had he hidden? That night, after tucking the twins into their crib, she pulled out an old laptop Vera had given her. It was slow, the keys sticky, but it worked. She started searching, News articles, business reports, anything she could find about Alexei's company, Volkov Enterprises. Hours bled into dawn, and then she saw it. A tiny footnote in a financial blog. A whisper of irregularity in the company's public filings. A shell corporation, buried in layers of paperwork, linked to the takeover she'd helped orchestrate 6 years ago. Her breath caught. It wasn't just theft of her ideas. It was theft of their empire, rerouted through lies and fraud. She didn't have the resources to prove it, not yet, but the crack was there, and she'd widen it, no matter how long it took. Back to today, April 1st, 2025. Alexei's face paled as Elena's story unfolded. The Shell Corporation, she couldn't know about that. He'd paid millions to bury it, to silence anyone who'd sniffed too close. His lawyers had assured him it was airtight. "You're bluffing," he said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "You've got nothing." Elena raised an eyebrow. "Nothing? I found the first thread, Alexei, and I kept pulling. You'd be amazed what a desperate woman can uncover when she's got nothing left to lose." He took a step back, his mind racing. The Shell Company had been his insurance, a slush fund to grease palms, to secure deals, to build the empire faster than the law allowed. He'd told himself it was necessary, that everyone did it, but if Elena had evidence... "What do you want?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Money? Revenge? Tell me, and let's end this." Elena laughed, a sound so devoid of warmth it chilled him. "You think this is about money? No, Alexei. This is about justice, for me, for them." She glanced at the twins, who watched in silence, their small faces unreadable. Mila spoke up again, her voice cutting through the room. "Mama says you took everything. Is that true?" Alexei's throat tightened. He couldn't answer, not to her. Instead, he turned to Elena. "If you've got proof, show it. Stop dragging this out." "Oh, I will," she said, her smile widening. "But we're not there yet. First, you need to know what happened 4 years ago, when I met someone who knew your secrets better than I ever did." The room seemed to tilt, the weight of her words pressing down on him. Someone else? Who? His enemies? A traitor in his ranks? He wanted to grab her, demand answers, but the twins' presence held him back. Their eyes, Mila's fierce, Maxim's quiet, pinned him in place, a judgment he couldn't escape. Elena leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You're not the only one who knows how to play dirty, Alexei. And the man I met? He taught me how to win." The air in the foyer grew heavier, thick with the scent of rain and the unspoken threat in Elena's words. Alexei's pulse hammered in his ears, each beat a reminder of how little control he had left. The twins sat on the sofa, Mila's fierce gaze still boring into him, while Maxim's small fingers traced the edges of his toy car, oblivious, or perhaps indifferent, to the storm unfolding around him. Elena stood like a sentinel between them, her presence a quiet, unshakable force. "Win?" Alexei spat the word, his voice cracking under the strain. "You think this is a game? You show up after 6 years, with kids and cryptic threats, and expect me to just, what, fall apart?" Elena's expression didn't flicker. "You're already falling apart, Alexei. You just don't see it yet. But you will. 4 years ago, I met someone who made sure of that." He clenched his fists, fighting the urge to shout, to demand she stop toying with him. "Who? Who's this mystery man? Some lowlife you scraped up to spite me?" Her lips twitched, a faint hint of amusement breaking through her icy demeanor. "Not a lowlife, a shadow. Someone who knew your world better than you ever did. And he didn't come to me. I found him." Alexei's stomach twisted. Shadows. He'd dealt with plenty in his rise to power, fixers, informants, men who traded secrets for cash. But the way Elena said it, with that quiet certainty, sent a chill down his spine. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just another pawn. "Tell me," he said, his voice low, almost pleading. "Who is he?" Elena straightened, her gaze unwavering. "His name doesn't matter, not yet. What matters is what he showed me. 4 years ago, I wasn't just a waitress anymore. I was a mother, a fighter, and I was starting to piece together the puzzle you left behind. He was the one who handed me the missing pieces. 4 years ago. The twins were 2 years old, their laughter a bright spot in the dim haze of Elena's new life. She'd moved out of the apartment above the laundromat, thanks to a promotion at the diner. Vera had made her a manager, a small but hard-won step up. The pay was better, enough to rent a modest house with a yard where Mila and Maxim could play. She'd even started night classes, studying accounting online, determined to claw her way back to some semblance of the life she'd lost. But Alexei haunted her. Not in a sentimental way. Those feelings had long since burned out. But as a question mark. The newspaper article from a year earlier had lit a spark, and she couldn't let it go. She'd kept digging, late at night after the twins were asleep, chasing threads about Volkov Enterprises. The shell corporation she'd found was just the beginning. There were whispers of more, buried in financial reports and anonymous forums. She wasn't a hacker, wasn't a detective, but she was relentless. One evening, while scrolling through an obscure business blog, she stumbled across a comment. Volkov's got skeletons. Ask the broker. No name, no context, just a cryptic nudge. The broker. It sounded like a myth, a ghost story for corporate sharks, but Elena was desperate enough to bite. She posted a reply, "Who's the broker? How do I find him?" and waited. Days later, an encrypted email landed in her inbox. No sender, just a single line. Midnight, Pier 17. Come alone. Her heart raced. It could be a trap, a scam, but the chance it wasn't outweighed the risk. She left the twins with Vera, drove to the pier in her beat-up sedan, and waited in the dark. He appeared like a specter, tall, lean, his face half hidden under a hood. His voice was gravelly, clipped. "You're the one asking about Volkov." Elena nodded, her throat dry. "I need to know what he's hiding." The man, the broker, studied her for a long moment. "Why?" She hesitated, then spoke the truth. "He took everything from me. I want it back." He didn't laugh or scoff. Instead, he pulled a USB drive from his pocket and tossed it to her. "Start here. Offshore accounts, dummy corporations, bribes. It's not the full picture, but it's enough to hurt him." She caught it, her fingers trembling. "Why help me?" The broker shrugged. "I don't like kings who forget their pawns. Volkov's sloppy. Thinks he's untouchable. Prove him wrong." Before she could ask more, he vanished into the night. Back home, she plugged the drive into her laptop and opened the files. Hours passed as she pored over spreadsheets, emails, transactions, evidence of Alexei's greed laid bare. He'd siphoned millions, not just from their original company, but from investors, partners, even charities. The shell corporation she'd found was one of dozens, a web of deceit stretching across continents. She didn't sleep that night. The broker had given her a weapon, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. She needed more, needed to connect the dots. So she kept going, using her accounting skills to trace the money, her anger to fuel her focus. The twins slept soundly in the next room, unaware that their mother was forging a path to ruin the man who'd abandoned them all. Back to today, April 1st, 2025. Alexei's breath came shallow and fast. The broker. He'd heard the name before, a phantom in the underworld of corporate espionage, a man who traded in secrets no one else could find. If Elena had met him, if she had proof. "You're lying," he said, but the words felt flimsy, a shield made of paper. "You expect me to believe some shadowy figure just handed you my life on a platter?" Elena's smile was razor thin. "Not your life, not then, just the edges of it." But I didn't stop there. The broker gave me a start, and I ran with it. Every late night, every stolen hour, I built the case, and I wasn't alone for long. "Alone?" Alexei's eyes narrowed. "Who else?" She glanced at the twins, then back at him. "People who saw what you couldn't. A woman with nothing to lose is dangerous. Friends, allies, even strangers who hated you as much as I did. But the real blow? That came 3 years ago, when I walked into your world again, and you didn't even know it. Maxim yawned, his small head drooping against Mila's shoulder. The girl nudged him gently, her eyes never leaving Alexei. "He's tired," she said, her voice flat. "Mama, can we go soon?" "Soon," Elena promised, her tone softening for a moment. Then she turned back to Alexei, her gaze hardening. "You built an empire on sand, Alexei, and I've spent years learning how to make it collapse." He stared at her, at the twins, at the wreckage of his certainty. The broker's files. Did she still have them? What else had she found? His mind raced, grasping for a way to turn this back, to regain the upper hand. But her next words stopped him cold. 3 years ago, she said, I got inside Volkov Enterprises, and that's when I found the key to your destruction. The chandelier's light flickered overhead, casting jagged shadows across the foyer as Elena's words sank in. Alexei's chest tightened, his breath shallow and uneven. Inside Volkov Enterprises, 3 years ago? Impossible. He'd tightened security after the early days, hired the best to guard his secrets, cameras, encrypted servers, loyal lieutenants who'd bleed before they'd betray him. Yet here she stood, claiming she'd breached his fortress without him ever suspecting. You're delusional, he said, forcing a sneer to mask the panic clawing at him. You think you could waltz into my company undetected? I'd have known. Someone would have told me. Elena's eyes glinted, sharp and unyielding. Would they? You've always overestimated loyalty, Alexei. Money buys silence, but it doesn't buy trust. And I didn't need to waltz in. I had help from someone already inside. His stomach dropped. A traitor. The word burned in his mind, conjuring faces. His CFO, his head of security, the endless parade of suits who'd kissed his ring while pocketing his bonuses. Who? He wanted to demand a name, to shake it out of her, but the twins' presence held him back. Mila's gaze hadn't wavered, her small face a mask of quiet judgment, while Maxim's head rested on her shoulder, his toy car slipping from his grasp to the floor with a soft clatter. Help, Alexei echoed, his voice hoarse. Who'd risk crossing me for you? Elena stepped closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Someone who saw what you did to me, and to them. She nodded toward the twins. Someone who knew the cost of your ambition and decided it was time to balance the scales. The room spun, the edges blurring as her words hit home. She wasn't bluffing. The certainty in her tone, the weight of her stare, it was real, 3 years ago. He tried to think back, to pinpoint any sign, any slip, but his memory was a haze of triumphs and boardroom battles. Tell me, he said, desperation creeping in. What did you find? What's this key? Elena's lips curved, a faint, triumphant smile. Patience, Alexei. You'll get the full story. But first, let me take you back to when I stepped into your shadow again. 3 years ago, Elena's life had stabilized, though it was a far cry from the penthouse days. The modest house with the yard was home now, filled with the twins' drawings and the scent of Vera's borscht on weekends. Mila and Maxim were 3, their personalities blooming. Mila bold and fierce, Maxim quiet and thoughtful. Elena had finished her accounting course, landing a part-time job at a small firm. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and sharpened her skills. The broker's files had become her obsession. She'd spent 2 years deciphering them, cross-referencing names and numbers with public records, building a map of Alexei's deceit. The shell corporations were a labyrinth, but she'd traced enough to see the pattern, millions funneled through fake entities. Tax evasion on a scale that could topple him if exposed. Still, she needed more. Hard evidence, not just digital ghosts. The opportunity came unexpectedly. A client at the accounting firm mentioned a job opening at Volkov Enterprises. Entry-level, data entry, nothing flashy. Elena's heart raced. It was a long shot, a risk, but the chance to get inside was too tempting. She applied under a false name, Elena Petrova, a bland alias with a fabricated resume. Her hair was dyed blonde, her past scrubbed clean. To her shock, she got the job. Her first day was surreal. Walking into the gleaming tower of Volkov Enterprises, she felt like a spy in enemy territory. The lobby buzzed with ambition, suits barking into phones, screens flashing stock prices. She kept her head down, blending into the army of underpaid workers who kept the machine running. Her role was menial, inputting numbers, filing reports, but it gave her access, not to the executive suites, not yet, but to the system. Weeks passed, and she watched, listened, learned. Then she met Nadia. Nadia was a mid-level manager in finance, sharp-eyed and weary, with a dry wit that hid a deeper discontent. She'd been with the company since the early days, back when Elena was still Alexei's partner. They'd never met then. Nadia worked the numbers while Elena strategized, but she recognized Elena's face one day over coffee in the break room. "You look familiar," Nadia said, stirring her cup. "Ever been here before?" Elena froze, her alias teetering on the edge of collapse. But something in Nadia's tone, curious, not accusing, made her take a chance. "A lifetime ago," she admitted. "Before things changed." Nadia's eyes narrowed, then widened. "You're her, the wife he erased." The words hung between them, a bridge or a trap. Elena nodded, bracing for betrayal. Instead, Nadia leaned in, her voice low. "I've hated him for years. What he did to you, it's just the start. You want dirt? I've got it." Over months, Nadia became her ally. She fed Elena files, unredacted reports, emails Alexei thought were deleted, proof of bribes to regulators. The key came late one night, when Nadia slipped her a hard drive. "This is it," she whispered. "The master ledger. Every dirty dollar he's ever moved. He finds out I gave you this. I'm dead." Elena took it, her hands steady despite the weight. "He won't find out. Not until it's too late." Back to today, April 1st, 2025. Alexei's knees buckled, and he gripped the edge of a nearby table to steady himself. The master ledger. If it existed, if she had it, it was a death knell. Every deal, every payoff, every lie he'd told to climb higher, all documented. He'd suspected leaks over the years, plugged them with firings and threats, but this was betrayal on a scale he hadn't imagined. "Nadia," he muttered, the name surfacing like a ghost. It was her, wasn't it? Elena didn't confirm or deny, but her silence was answer enough. "You surrounded yourself with people you thought you could control," she said. "But control isn't loyalty. I learned that. Nadia did too." He shook his head, disbelief warring with dread. "Even if you got inside, even if you have this ledger, you can't use it. It's inadmissible. Stolen. I'll bury you in court." Her laugh was soft, chilling. "Court? You think this ends in a courtroom? No, Alexei. This ends with you losing everything. Not just your money, but your name, your power, your legacy. And it's already started." Mila stood suddenly, her small frame rigid. "Mama, he's scared now, like you said he'd be." Elena knelt beside her, brushing a hand over her hair. "He should be, sweetheart. He's starting to see." Alexei's vision blurred, rage and fear colliding. "What do you mean, already started? What have you done?" Elena rose, her gaze locking onto his. 2 years ago, I set the final piece in motion. A piece you'll never see coming, not until it's too late. Sleep on that tonight, Alexei. Tomorrow, we finish this." She turned to the twins, gathering their things. Maxim rubbed his eyes, sleepy and plaintive, while Mila shot Alexei one last look, pure, unfiltered disdain. As they moved toward the door, Elena paused, glancing back. "By the way," she said, "the twins, they're yours. Thought you should know before it all comes crashing down." The door slammed shut behind her, leaving Alexei alone with the echo of her words and the certainty that his world was already unraveling. The door's slam reverberated through the foyer, a final punctuation to Elena's exit. Alexei stood frozen, the silence pressing against him like a physical weight. The twins were his. The words clawed at him, tearing through years of denial and self-deception. Mila's fierce eyes, Maxim's quiet intensity. They were his blood, his legacy, and he'd cast them out along with her. Now they were back, not as heirs, but as harbingers of his ruin. He stumbled to the sofa where the twins had sat, sinking into it as his legs gave out. The toy car Maxim had dropped lay on the floor, its chipped paint a mute witness to the life he'd never known. His empire, Volkov Enterprises, the gleaming tower of his ambition, felt distant now, a mirage dissolving in the heat of Elena's revelations. The master ledger, a traitor inside, a plan set in motion 2 years ago. His mind raced, grasping for a lifeline, but every thread led back to her. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. "Tomorrow," she'd said. "Tomorrow we finish this." He had hours to figure out what she'd done, to stop her. But the weight of 6 years, of every choice he'd made since that stormy night, pinned him in place. He poured another whiskey, the bottle trembling in his hands, and let his thoughts drift to her final move. 2 years ago. Elena stood in a cramped office, the hum of a printer in the background as she handed the hard drive, the master ledger, to a man in a cheap suit. His name was Victor, a journalist with a reputation for digging where others feared to tread. She'd found him through the broker, a connection forged in late-night calls and mutual disdain for men like Alexei. Victor's eyes gleamed as he plugged the drive into his laptop, the screen lighting up with rows of damning numbers. "This is it," he said, his voice low with awe. "Volkov's finished. Offshore accounts, bribes, tax evasion. It's all here. How'd you get this?" Elena's smile was tight. "Doesn't matter. What matters is what you do with it." Victor leaned back, rubbing his stubbled chin. "Publish now and it's a scandal. But wait, build a case, corroborate it. It's a takedown. Which do you want?" She thought of the twins, 4 years old then, their lives shaped by her struggle. She thought of Alexei sitting atop his throne, oblivious to the cracks beneath him. "I want him to feel it," she said, "not just a headline. I want him to lose everything, slowly, piece by piece." Victor nodded, understanding flickering in his gaze. "Then we wait. I'll dig deeper, find witnesses, cross-check the data. When it hits, it'll be a tidal wave." For 2 years, they worked in secret. Elena fed him leads from her time at Volkov Enterprises, names Nadia had whispered, patterns she'd memorized. Victor tracked down ex-employees, bribed officials who'd taken Alexei's money, even a regulator who'd kept quiet for a cut. The story grew, a sprawling web of corruption with Alexei at its center. Meanwhile, Elena raised the twins, shielding them from the war she waged. Mila asked questions. "Why do you work so late, Mama? Who's the bad man?" And Elena answered with half-truths, promising one day they'd understand. Maxim listened more than he spoke, his quiet presence a balm to her frayed nerves. They were her strength, her reason, and soon they'd be her victory. 6 months ago, Victor called. "It's ready. The exposé's locked. Front page, every major outlet. We've got documents, testimonies, the works. Once it drops, the feds will be all over him." "You sure about this?" Elena stood in her kitchen, watching Mila and Maxim chase each other in the yard. "I've never been more sure." "When do you want it to hit?" Victor asked. "April 1st, she said. 6 years to the day he threw me out. Let him wake up to it." Today, April 1st, 2025. Dawn Alexei didn't sleep. The whiskey sat untouched, his mind too wired to numb. At 6 a.m., his phone buzzed, a news alert. His hands shook as he opened it. The headline screamed, "Volkov Enterprises exposed. Fraud, bribery, and a decade of lies." Below it, a photo of him, grainy but unmistakable, alongside a leaked ledger page, his signature scrawled across a payment to a shell company. The story was everywhere. CNN, Bloomberg, X posts lighting up with outrage. Investors were pulling out, the stock plummeting before the market even opened. His lawyer called, frantic. "Alexei, we're fucked. The feds are at the office. Where are you?" He didn't answer. The phone slipped from his hand as the front door burst open. Elena stood there again, the twins behind her, their faces solemn. She held a newspaper, the headline glaring in black ink. "Morning," she said, her voice calm. "Thought you'd want to see it in print." Alexei stared at her, then at the twins. His children, strangers who'd grown up hating him. "You did this," he rasped. "You destroyed me." "No," Elena said, stepping forward. "You destroyed yourself. I just made sure the world saw it." Mila tugged at her hand. "Can we go now, Mama?" He looked sad. Elena nodded, guiding them back to the door. "He'll be fine, Mila. He's got a lot to think about." Epilogue. 1 month later. Volkov Enterprises was gone, dismantled by lawsuits and federal raids. Alexei sat in a rented apartment, a far cry from the mansion, his name a punchline on late-night shows. He'd lost everything: wealth, power, pride. The twins' faces haunted him, a mirror of what could have been. Elena moved forward. The expose had made her a quiet hero. Offers poured in, but she chose a simple life, raising Mila and Maxim with Vera's help. She didn't gloat, didn't revel. She'd won, not for revenge, but for them. One question lingered, unspoken but heavy. Could he have stopped it? If he'd let her stay that night, if he'd shared the empire instead of hoarding it, would they be a family now? He'd never know. The rain had washed away that chance 6 years ago, and all he had left was the wreckage, and the twins' gray eyes, staring back in his dreams.